Another section of assets in the balance sheet is long-term assets. Different from current assets, long-term assets are those assets expected to be converted to cash or consumed for more than 1 year or one operating cycle. The typical examples are long-term investments. This investment often refers to the stock holdings in other companies. PPE is fixed assets. These assets usually can be used for years or even decades. Intangible assets and other long-term assets. Again, let's take a glance of Nike's long-term assets. It reports property, plant, equipment. This PPE is owned, while the other one is leased. For leasing will be introduced in the intermediate accounting tool. The difference between lease and the property, plant, equipment, the PPE is owned by the company, which was from the prior purchase, while lease, the company do not have the title of the assets, a lease agreement with the lessor. Identifiable intangible assets and goodwill. Deferred income taxes and other assets. And goodwill is an intangible asset which is unidentifiable. Long-term investments. Different from the short-term investment I introduced in the current assets, and these investments, their duration is longer, more than 1 year. These assets are not used directly in the operation of the business. For example, the investment in equity and debt securities of other corporations. So these assets, these investments are held for interest and dividend or even capital gain from this investment in the securities. And holding equity securities of other companies may represent a company's strategic influence on these companies. Land held for speculation. If the land is for operating purpose, it will be part of PPE. For example, if the company purchased a land and built their factory for manufacturing, the land will be classified as PPE. But here it is for speculation. This is investment purpose. Long-term receivables. For some receivables, these payments will be received over 1 year. The company should classify these receivables as long-term investments. And usually, for the receivables longer than 1 year, the company also earns interest from these receivables. When we classify the assets into either short-term or long-term, do not base down the name. Usually, when we mention receivables, by default, it is current assets. But for some receivables, if their holding period is greater than 1 year, these receivables should be reported in the non-current assets. Cash set aside for special purpose. It is also called restricted cash. Cash with restriction. These are money held for purpose. For example, pay off the long-term debt or for the future large purchase. And these cash have restrictions. They are not liquid anymore. Because of loss of liquidity, we should classify these cash set aside to be non-current assets. PPE, property, plant, equipment. This is also an operating asset. The reason is this set of assets is used for operating purpose. And this assets is reported at original cost less accumulated depreciation. Property, plant, equipment is reported as net book value, but actually in the notes, you will see more detailed information. In the notes, the company should report PPE at cost, at original acquisition cost, and then subtract, accumulate depreciation. Then the difference is PPE net book value. In the balance sheet, you only see this number, while in the notes, you have more information. So you should know the PPE net represents the difference between PPE at original cost and the accumulated depreciation. It includes land, buildings, equipment, machinery, furnitures. So these fixed assets are part of property, plant, equipment. Maybe I use different book for another class, but natural resources can be classified into different accounts. But here, it mentioned natural resources as part of property, plant, equipment. Probably it represents the property. But natural resources usually is also considered as another category of long-term assets. Intangible assets. These assets lack physical substance. It generally represents exclusive rights. Similar to the PPE, intangible assets, also here, these identifiable intangible assets are reported as the original cost of intangible assets, and subtract, accumulate, amortization. Then the difference, intangible assets, net book value. Apology for my handwriting because the iPad is unstable. Amortization is an expense which reduces the book value of intangible assets, while depreciation is an expense reduce the book value of fixed assets. We use two different words to represent the expense for two different types of assets. These assets usually are purchased externally. For the internally developed intangible assets, the US GAAP has more conservative accounting treatment. Most expenditures companies spend on developing intangible assets are recorded as expenditure, like research and development expense. Only the assets is feasible, especially for the software. It can be capitalized as intangible assets. But most expenditures on developing intangible assets are expensed when they are incurred. The example of intangible assets includes patents, copyrights, trademarks, franchises, and goodwill. Why patents is an intangible asset? Because it represents the exclusive rights. And the patents are good for 20 years. So that's why it is classified as long-term assets. And goodwill is special because goodwill is not amortizable. In other words, there is no amortization for goodwill. For PPE, land is special. Land is one of the assets in PPE that is not subject to depreciation. So there's no depreciation for land. Other long-term assets. That may include many different types of assets that will be consumed or converted into cash more than 1 year. Again, let's take a multiple choice question. Which one is most likely to be reported as long-term assets? Buildings. Prepaid rent is prepaid expense, inventory, receivables. Generally, they are classified as current assets, which represents tangible long-life assets used in operations of the business. Current assets is not long-life assets. Investment can be classified as current or non-current investment, and also they are not directly related to the operation. while intangible assets is not tangible. So only choice is property, plant, equipment, which is also used for operation